Hello, my name is Dean Gonzalez, lead trainer with dotCMS, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on RESTful Content API forms. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started covering the scope of this webinar, I'd like to remind you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to post questions that you have during the webinar, and I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the presentation. So please locate the chat area of the GoToWebinar control panel now so you can post any questions that you have. At the end of this webinar, I will also provide you with links to this video, examples, and documentation resources. Okay, so let's get started by talking about the scope of this session. This webinar covers the basic components and the many ways to submit content via the REST API. We'll examine how form data can be prepared, how to save binary files, and relate the submitted content to other existing content in the system. We will also show how to examine the response header for successful content creation and how to load and update existing content using a demonstration employee profile form. All methodologies covered in this webinar can be located in the dotCMS documentation on how to save content via the REST API. There are many different curl command examples and form examples that can be copied and pasted into a command line interface or onto a dotCMS page that will create dotCMS content when submitted. It is important to note that front-end content contribution is not allowed in dotCMS by default. However, changing the following property to true in the .marketing.config properties file will enable it. The REST API content allow front-end saving property is set to false by default, but can be set to true in a configuration plugin to enable any outside anonymous user to submit dotCMS content using a REST API form. In addition to setting the configuration property, there are two permission settings that are required for successful front-end content contribution by a non-logged-in user. The CMS Anonymous role must have both the ability to add to on a site and edit child content or files to the site. Additionally, the CMS Anonymous user will need, at least, edit permissions on the content type that will be submitted by the form. Let's look at an example of what the site permissions for anonymous front-end users should look like. After editing a site and clicking on the Permissions tab, the CMS Anonymous role needs to have both view and add to on the host, at least edit on content types and content and files. The CMS Anonymous role should have edit on child content types on the site so that when new content types are created, the outside anonymous user will already be able to submit content using that content type when a new form is created. Here's some basic concepts that are good to know when creating Content API forms. Any JavaScript framework can be used to create Content API forms: jQuery, Node.js, Angular, vanilla JavaScript, and so on. JSON, XML, and form URL-encoded content types can be used to submit content. Multi-part form data is also supported, and regardless of the methodology being used to construct the form will really just send a data map of both labels and values that should match the format of the fields on the dotCMS content type. When saving binary files, dotCMS supports both put and post requests using HTML5 form data. However, it is also important to note that binary files must also be appended using the same basic append file command. So it is very important that the files on the form are appended in the same order that the binary fields appear on the content type. So if two photos were going to be submitted, as in the examples, photo 1 would be appended before photo 2 so that they are inserted to the proper content type's binary fields. As this chart shows, HTML5's form data is supported by all major browsers and device types. Form data is fully supported by the dotCMS Content API, and form data will be used in the example form demonstration. Examine the URL formation in this example. API content save 1 can be used to save content as a working draft, or API content publish 1 can be used to instantly save and publish form submitted content. It is important to mention that when attaching binary files, the process data and content type parameters must be set to false before submitting the form. Otherwise, jQuery will try to run non-string data through jQuery.param to serialize object keys, and this does not play nicely with form data and will result in errors. Simply setting these two properties to false will avoid binary files from being sent through the serializer before the submit. dotCMS REST API forms support submitting multiple contentlets using the same form code, in addition to creating relationships between content. Additional content submissions can be submitted after the successful response from the first content submission. So in the example here at the bottom of the slide, we can see how to use a JavaScript function to assign the response headers to a variable so that the response can be examined for values that will indicate successful content submission. On successful content creation, 3 header values are returned. Location is a pointer to where content can be obtained using the Content REST API, the identifier of the submitted content object, and the inode of the submitted content version. The demonstration form will examine the response headers for the content identifier, thereby validating successful content creation. If the response header indicates successful submission of an employee profile, then the second part of the form will relate the employee to an existing department and add a relationship between the two pieces of content. After reading a successful response on the demonstration form, the following format is used to relate the employee content to an existing department by adding the relationship name to the form data, followed by a query for the right employee by the employee content identifier that returned in the response header, so that the relationship between the department and employee contentlets can also be made using the same form submission. Use Velocity to test for the presence of a logged-in user or a content identifier being passed to the page. Either of these two methods can be used to access existing content in the system so that it can be updated. Match the user ID to a contentlet field or use the .content.find tool passing a content identifier to match existing content by identifier and load the existing content into the form fields. Submit the form, adding the content identifier to the form data to find and update the matching existing .cms content. So after we create an employee, we will immediately look at how to use the same form to examine for either a logged-in user with an existing profile or simply a content identifier. If either of these are read by the form, it will automatically load the existing employee profile content into the same form code we used to originally submit the employee profile in the first place. Before we begin the form demonstration, I want everyone to know that you'll be receiving an email with the following links: to a push publishing bundle created on the dotCMS 3.2.4 version that you can immediately upload to your own development server to see a full working example of this form. It will have all of the files, content, pages, and forms inside the bundle, including instructions on how to upload it. We will also be posting this webinar on the dotcms.com videos page, on the dotCMS YouTube channel, and we will send you links to the REST Content API documentation. So now let's look at a REST Content API form that creates employee profile content, uploads a binary file, creates a relationship to a department, and allows users to log in and update their existing profiles. There is also an example of a dynamic employee listing that links to an SEO optimized detail page and shows all the submitted profile information. Here on the dotCMS Quest Financial demo site, I've altered the employee listing to correspond to the backend demo users in the system. I've also added an SEO optimized employee profile detail page that will build a unique detail URL for each employee in the system. If I click on Charles Merrill from this page, I am led to a detail page which displays more fields and more detailed information about the employee. By clicking on the Submit Profile page, a new employee profile can be added to the system. For ease of use, this page is not hidden behind an employee login, but I'll also show how the same page will act as an employee profile update page by merely logging in as one of the backend users who has an existing profile. So if I add a new employee, let's add another famous banker to the system. Add the contact information, choose a binary profile photo, and then select the department that the employee works in. The department select box is dynamically built by using Velocity and JavaScript to pull department content live from the department content type. Upon submitting the profile, the employee content is saved as a child of the employee content type, and a relationship is created to the corresponding department content. A click on the profile link on the success page reveals the submitted content that can be immediately updated as necessary. Now normally you might want a submit profile page to require a user login to both submit and update an existing profile. So if we log in as a different user who has a user ID and a user profile that has already been approved and published, the login recognizes the logged in user, displays a customized intranet interface, and provides an update profile link that leads to the exact form code that we used before. However, this time the form is detecting the user, checking the employee content type for a matching user ID on an existing profile, and loading the user's profile information for editing. So here I'll correct a mistake on the employee profile's job title, resubmit the form, and see the change reflected on the profile detail page. Okay, so I've shown you how the form works. Now let's take a look at the form code. Here at the top of the employee profile form, we are detecting whether a user has been set. If a user has been set, then search for a matching user ID inside the employee content, and if found, use the .content.find tool, passing an employee content identifier to set an employee profile variable. If the user is logged into the front end and the employee profile content exists, or if an employee ID is being passed in the URL, then we will parse an employee update form instead of the create new profile form below. Now we begin a submit employee function in JavaScript and begin defining the data map of labels and values by recording the user's IP address and defining the content type that we will submit. Next, we assign the HTML5 form data to a JavaScript variable called dataForm and begin defining all of the JavaScript IDs that will be supplied with values by the HTML form fields at the bottom of the form. So here we are just defining the data map. Next, since the Content API already is configured to recognize it, we will take the data object and assign it to the JSON key. Next, we append the binary file to the form data. Since binary files are added using the same file declaration, it is important to append binary files in the exact order that they appear on the content type. Next, we define the Content API URL, passing it the publish parameter and the number 1 indicating true. Normally, the save parameter would be used instead of the automatic publishing of externally submitted content so that the content could be reviewed and then published. The request type is defined as a put, although a post could also be used, and the data form variable is passed as the form data. Since the form includes a non-string data type, it is important to set process data and content type to false to avoid serialization errors by the jQuery.param. Next, the commented form code shows that we are not submitting an authorized user, but merely relying on the plugin configuration setting to allow CMS anonymous submission of front-end content. In the success function, we read and strip the newly created employee content identifier from the response headers and use it to create a relationship to the department defined in the department select field by passing the department identifier to the department data in the second form submit. The employee that needs to be related to the department is defined by the query by content ID that is paired with the relationship name and submitted with the department data. The department data is sent in a second form submit using the same methodology as the first. In the HTML form fields below, if a logged in user is detected, the first name, last name, and email fields will be auto-populated on the form from the .cms user data, even if the user has not already submitted a profile. Next, we will set the gender radio button field, check to the first value by default, then the job title, then the phone, mobile, and fax fields. Now, to keep this form simple, I have avoided adding format validation, but of course that should be handled. Next, we display the management checkbox, and using the input type file, display the binary photo field. For the department we want to relate to the employee content, we build a select box by pulling the existing department data using velocity. This will set the department data that will only be submitted in a second put request if the employee content submits successfully. Finally, only if the user is set, we store the user ID in a hidden form field. If we save the user ID to the employee profile content, then the next time the employee logs in, we can use this field to match the user to an existing profile and update the existing content, which brings us back to the code at the top of the page. Once again, if a logged-in user is present, the first thing we do is search by that user ID for a matching employee profile contentlet using Velocity. If the user and the employee profile identifier is set, or an ID is passed in the URL, then we .parse and execute the Update Employee Profile VTL. In the Update Employee Profile VTL, we are first grabbing the existing content identifier that should be set to ID in the URL using a request.getParameter statement and setting that to employee identifier. Then assigning to employee profile the complete map of the contentlet using the .content.find tool, passing the identifier. Next, we find out if the existing content has a related department by passing the employee profile identifier into a .content.pull related statement in Velocity. The only different treatment of the data here is that we must set the identifier, in addition to the content type variable name and the IP address. Passing the identifier ensures that the form submit will update the existing content via the REST API instead of creating new content as before. The rest of the form data for both the employee and the department is handled in the same way as before. The only difference in the HTML form fields is that we greet the user back and invite them to update their profile, and then set the values of the fields using Velocity to the values encountered in the content. For the rest of the non-required fields, we check to see if the Velocity content exists. If not, we do not set the value. The binary employee photo being set requires some minor special handling. If the photo has already been set, then we load a resized image of the profile photo next to the field and the name of the photo. Otherwise, the field is the same. If no new photo is uploaded, the existing binary field will not be altered. For the department field, if the employee profile is already related to a department, we mark it as selected in the list. Otherwise, we load the select option as before. Finally, we set the hidden field for the user to be the currently logged in user ID, load it if set on the content field, or leave it blank. And that is all there is to this Update Content API form. Really, it's just passing the content identifier in the data and then loading the existing content into the form fields. Okay, so that concludes the prepared presentation on REST API forms, and we will now start the question and answer portion of the webinar. If you'd like to submit a question, please locate the chat portion of the GoToWebinar control panel and submit any questions you may have. If you don't have any questions, thanks for joining us, and once again, I will be sending a link to the video of this form webinar to everyone who registered. I'm going to stop presenting for just a second to switch screens and start the question and answer session. So give me just a few seconds and I will be right back.